They called her just a nurse. What they didn't know was that Captain Ashley Cooper had held more lives together than most surgeons ever saw. What they didn't know was that the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside her jacket lining wasn't decoration, it was a reminder. It was a warning. 3 seconds. That's all it took for her to assess room exits, security protocols, and exit vectors the moment she walked into any space. They had no idea what was standing in front of them. Seattle General's ICU hummed with fluorescent lights and antiseptic sharpness. The kind of smell that lived in your scrubs even after you showered, bleach and broken hope, and somewhere beneath it all, the coppered trace of blood that no amount of hand sanitizer could completely remove. Ashley moved through the unit with practiced invisibility, the way people move through spaces where they're expected to blend into the walls. Her scrubs were navy, unremarkable. Her shoes were white and worn. Her badge hung from a lanyard next to a small wooden cross that meant nothing and everything. She paused outside room 347 before entering, her right hand reaching inside her jacket where the unit patch lived against her ribs. 3 times per shift, she did this. Once at the start. Once at the midpoint. Once before she left. The fabric was faded almost white now, the embroidered Ranger scroll barely visible, but her fingertip found it every single time like it was a compass rose. Like it was the only true north she had left. Her hand dropped. She knocked. Once. Soft. "Come in," a woman's voice called from inside, and Ashley pushed the door open with her left hand, leading with her non-dominant side the way someone trained in room clearing learned to move. Keep your strong hand free, assume nothing, read the space before you entered it. Colonel Marcus Webb lay in the bed with the morning light making his gray hair look white. Decorated officer. Multiple gunshot wounds from Bagram. 3 deployments worth of classified operations that lived in redacted sections of his chart that Ashley wasn't supposed to understand but understood perfectly. His daughter sat in the chair beside the bed, and his wife stood by the window with her arms crossed, the protective posture of someone who'd held a soldier through things no military had a real name for. They both looked up when Ashley entered. "There she is," Webb said, his voice rough but warm. "This is the nurse I was telling you about. Stayed with me through the whole surgery. Hands like a surgeon herself." Ashley felt the attention land on her like a spotlight and her shoulders dropped just slightly, the practice motion of someone who knew how to make herself smaller, less threatening, more acceptable to the people around her. "Just doing my job, sir," she said, and the wife smiled at that, the particular smile that meant she'd decided Ashley was trustworthy. The daughter was younger, maybe 30, and she was studying Ashley with the sharp eyes of someone who'd also learned to read people quickly. "Mom said you were in here checking his vitals like every hour last night," she said. "Even after the morning shift showed up." "The colonel's recovery requires close monitoring," Ashley said, and she moved to the bed with the efficient grace of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The limp in her left leg was barely noticeable today, would get worse as the shift wore on, was the kind of thing that might make people assume weakness if they didn't know better. If they didn't know that her left knee had been shattered by shrapnel in 2019 and had been rewired with titanium and stubborn refusal to ever leave a soldier behind. She checked the 4-line first, 14-gauge catheter, good placement, no infiltration, fluid running clear. Her fingers were gentle but her eyes were clinical, the way someone moved their hands when every touch carried information. She'd been trained to read a patient's entire condition through her fingertips. Body temperature. Skin turgor. The slight twitch in the muscles that meant pain was present even in unconsciousness. Webb's vitals were stable, heart rate steady at 72, blood pressure solid at 118/76. Good. Strong. The man's body was healing the way Delta operators' bodies did, with the determination of someone who'd been broken before and knew how to put themselves back together. "How long have you been a nurse?" the daughter asked, and Ashley almost smiled at the question because it came with the assumption that she'd started late, that she'd found this career in her middle years, that she wasn't some girl who'd known at 18 what her life would be. 12 years, Ashley said, checking the heart monitor's rhythm with the practiced eye of someone who could read cardiac patterns the way other people read text. Started in Colorado Springs. Moved to Seattle 6 months ago. That's impressive, Webb's wife said. Especially given how hard it is to get experienced nurses to stay in one place. Ashley didn't say that she hadn't chosen Seattle General. That certain government agencies had certain patients they needed certain people to monitor without those certain people knowing they were being monitored. That her assignment had come through a secured Pentagon line that she answered once every 3 months, and that if anyone had looked too closely at her employment file they would have found the kind of gaps that only classified work left behind. Instead, she just nodded and continued with the patient assessment, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done emergency medicine in forward operating bases with nothing but moonlight and blood and prayer. She adjusted the drip rate on the 4, noted the exact time in the chart, 1847 hours, and was preparing to move to the next room when the door opened again and Dr. Pierce walked in with the kind of presence that made people instinctively sit up straighter. He was expensive-looking, the kind of doctor who had matching leather briefcase and expensive watch, and the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned about whether he knew what he was doing. The watch caught the fluorescent light as he reviewed the chart, and Ashley watched from her peripheral vision as his eyes narrowed slightly, the way a hunter's eyes focused when they'd spotted something interesting. "Captain Cooper," he said, using her rank with the flat tone of someone who'd read her file and found something unusual. "Spending considerable time with this patient, I see." There was a precision to the way he said it, like it was an accusation disguised as observation. Ashley's jaw tightened just slightly, the microscopic tell of someone who'd learned to control every reaction. "Colonel Webb requires close monitoring post-op," she said, keeping her voice level and professional, the voice of someone who was absolutely certain of her competence and would never dream of defending it. "Of course," Pierce said, and his eyes moved from the chart to her face, studying her the way a person studies an equation they suspect doesn't add up. "Just curious about the protocol level. Most post-op Delta patients have round-the-clock monitoring teams, not single nurses." The wife shifted slightly, the movement of someone who'd caught the sharp edge in that question. Webb's daughter leaned forward. And Ashley just nodded, her face giving nothing away, her internal organs running through rapid calculations about threat assessment and whether this man was noticing something he shouldn't. "My documentation follows the same protocols I've used for 6 months without issue," Ashley said, and her voice was calm as a flat line, steady as surgical steel. She met his eyes for just a moment, long enough to show she wasn't intimidated, short enough to show respect for hierarchy. Then she looked back at the chart. Pierce held her gaze for 3 seconds longer, and the room's air pressure seemed to change. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that predators wear when they've decided something is worth hunting. "I'm sure it does," he said. "We'll discuss your methodology later. In my office." It wasn't a request. It was a command. He left the room and Ashley finished her assessment with hands that didn't shake and a heart rate that didn't accelerate. Inside her jacket, against her ribs, the faded Ranger patch felt like it was burning. Because she'd just been given her first warning, and she understood warnings the way people understand warnings when they've survived being warned before. Something was wrong. Something was beginning. Something was about to walk through these hospital doors, and when it did, everything else would follow like dominoes made of classified operations and government agencies and the kind of secrets that got people killed. She touched the patch again before she left the room. Once more for good measure. Dr. Pierce entered room 347 at 0800 with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras. His voice rose deliberately, pitched to carry to the corner where Colonel Marcus Webb's daughter sat with her coffee. Ashley stood at the medication cart, charting the 0730 vitals with the precision that had kept 16 patients alive through her night shift. "Nurse Cooper," Pierce called out, holding her chart like a prosecution exhibit. "Your documentation is incomplete again. 3rd time this week." Ashley turned. Her hands remained steady. One measured breath. She crossed the room and took the chart from his outstretched fingers, scanning the entries that were meticulously complete, medication times logged to the minute, vital sign trends annotated with clinical context, the kind of charting that would survive a Medicare audit or a malpractice deposition. "My documentation follows the same protocol I've used for 6 months without issue, Dr. Pierce," she said. Her voice carried the flatness of a cardiac monitor between beats. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just fact. Pierce smiled the way a wolf smiles at a wounded calf. Perhaps night shift Nancy doesn't understand the standards we maintain for high-value patients. He gestured to the residents, who dutifully laughed. Colonel Webb's daughter shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her expression tightening. Ashley met Pierce's eyes without flinching. A single tear escaped, not from fear, but from the furious restraint required to stand motionless while a man with credentials and allies fabricated complaints in front of witnesses. She wiped the tear away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pierce's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears or stammering or a defensive explanation. Instead, he got a woman who absorbed the humiliation like reinforced concrete absorbs bullets, without damage, without sound. "We'll be monitoring your performance more closely from now on," he said, turning to leave. The residents followed, already composing the story they'd tell in the attending lounge. Just another competency issue, just another nurse who couldn't cut it. The room fell silent except for the ventilator wheeze from the bed beside them, a mechanical rhythm that Ashley's body had synced to during 18 years of night shifts. Colonel Webb watched her from his pillow, his eyes tracking her movement with the focus of a man trained to observe and remember everything. She didn't look at him. Not yet. At 1300, the break room was a study in calculated rejection. Ashley set her lunch on the table, black coffee and a protein bar, the same meal she'd eaten for 2 weeks, and opened the medical journal she'd been reading on her own time. Security protocols in high acuity settings. She'd memorized Pierce's patterns. For nurses entered, Sarah Chen, Jennifer Marcus, Diane Reeves, and Thomas from respiratory therapy. They'd all been friendly enough during the previous months. Sarah had lent her a stethoscope when hers broke. Jennifer had covered her shift when Jake was sick. They gathered their lunch containers and relocated to the far table with the synchronized movement of a school of fish fleeing a predator. Sarah whispered something. The others laughed while glancing back. The sound of rejection was quieter than anger, more cutting than words. Ashley didn't look up from her journal. Her hands didn't shake as she turned the page. But she catalogued every detail, the angle of their bodies, the timing of the glances, the precision of the exclusion. This wasn't accidental. Pierce had been thorough. By 1600, his efficiency became visible. A yellow disciplinary notice had been posted on the unit bulletin board, printed on the kind of bright paper that was designed to be impossible to miss. Every staff member who passed it read it, then avoided Ashley's eyes for the rest of the shift. Disciplinary action, A. Cooper. Insubordination and failure to maintain professional standards. Third documented violation. Dr. R. Pierce, attending physician. Date, 0800, 2024. She read it once, committed every word to memory, then returned to her work. The notice was a strategic move, not rage, but calculation. Pierce was creating a paper trail. He was documenting her as unstable, difficult, a liability. Each disciplinary action made it easier to justify the next one. He was building a case. At 1830, Pierce appeared at the medication cart where Ashley was logging the evening antibiotics. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone overhead. His cologne arrived before he did, expensive, the kind that costs what some people's rent costs. "You know what I think, night shift." His voice was low enough that only she could hear. "I think you're taking too much interest in patients that don't concern you. I think you ask too many questions about billing codes and insurance authorizations." He leaned against the counter, his posture casual, conversational. The predator at rest. "I think you need to remember your place before you forget how to keep this job." Ashley's hands continued logging the medications. Ceftriaxone 2 grams 4. Metoprolol 25 milligrams PO. Her handwriting was perfect calligraphy under pressure. The kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst. "I think patient care should always be the priority, Dr. Pierce," she said. His jaw tightened. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts." He walked away. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. The billing department email arrived at 0900 the next morning, copied to Pierce, copied to hospital administration, copied to the compliance officer. Ashley sat in the staff lounge before her shift, holding her phone with hands that remained perfectly still, and read the message flagging 17 procedures for Colonel Webb, each one with irregular coding patterns that inflated Medicare reimbursement by thousands of dollars. She recognized the signature immediately. The coding combinations were too sophisticated to be accidental. Someone was systematically maximizing reimbursement for combat veteran treatments. Someone was making money from the colonel's injuries. Pierce appeared within an hour, transfer order already printed. Hospital policy for .7.1 regarding optimal staff utilization. Effective immediately. Ashley was being reassigned to the surgical floor. Away from the colonel. Away from whatever Pierce was doing. Colonel Webb requires continuity of care, Ashley said. He requires care from staff who follow directions. Pierce signed the order in front of her and left. At 1400, through the observation window of the surgical corridor, Ashley saw Pierce enter the colonel's room with a pharmacy bag not logged in the medication system. The contents were antihistamines and a sedative combination that looked routine until he realized the doses were off, too high, stacked together, the kind of combination that would cloud a patient's memory, make billing discrepancies impossible to verify. Her hands moved on their own. She photographed the cart from the hallway, transmitting the image through an encrypted dead drop on the hospital Wi-Fi network that only she and her military handler could access. The 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt like it was burning against her ribs. By 1700, Pierce had filed his second formal complaint. Security reviewed the hallway camera footage. They found nothing illegal about her presence there, but the implication was established: she was where she shouldn't be, photographing things that weren't her business. Unstable. Obsessive. The kind of employee who created liability. Her cover was fracturing. The mission was fracturing. And then at 1900, as she walked toward the parking lot, Colonel Webb's daughter approached her. Her name was Rebecca. She had her father's eyes. "My father keeps asking for you specifically," Rebecca said quietly. "He says you remind him of someone from his unit. He says you move like a soldier." Ashley's pace didn't change. Her breathing remained level. But every instinct, every training, every buried piece of her identity was suddenly pulling toward the surface like a depth charge ascending. "I'm just his nurse," Ashley said. "No," Rebecca said. "You're not." The billing department email arrived at 0900, subject line flagged urgent. Ashley sat in the med-surg break room with her coffee cooling untouched, 17 procedures listed in ascending order of irregularity. Procedure codes that didn't match the documented interventions. Medicare billings that exceeded standard protocols by factors of 3, sometimes 4. Each flagged entry included a timestamp, a patient initials column, and a red asterisk beside Colonel Marcus Webb's name appearing 11 times across the list. She didn't react. She read the email twice, committing the pattern to memory the way soldiers commit coordinates to memory, not writing anything down, not opening a second window, just absorbing the architecture of the fraud as though it were a map she'd need to navigate in darkness. The email was addressed to all ICU and MedSurg nursing staff requesting charting verification and clarification on documentation practices. Generic enough. Routine enough. Except it wasn't. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in institutional white, and Ashley set the tablet down on the plastic break table beside a week-old copy of the Seattle General Quarterly newsletter. 17 procedures. 11 belonged to Colonel Webb. The billing pattern showed a clear escalation, modest irregularities in the first 6 weeks, then systematic inflation. Medicare fraud structured like a staircase, each step slightly higher than the last, designed so no single procedure looked egregious enough to trigger automatic audit flags. Someone had built this carefully. Someone who understood how billing systems worked, how to stay just beneath the threshold of detection, how to distribute the fraud across enough cases that a casual review would look like documentation inconsistencies rather than intentional manipulation. Someone like Dr. Kevin Pierce, who'd spent 18 years at Seattle General and held a seat on the finance committee. Ashley's hands remained steady as she reached for her cold coffee. The taste was bitter, the way it always was after sitting for 10 minutes. She took another sip anyway, thinking through the timeline. Pierce's social attacks had started 6 weeks ago, precisely when the billing irregularities began their climb. His condescending remarks in the hallway. The snide comments about her charting. The way he'd started watching her whenever she worked Colonel Webb's care. He wasn't trying to intimidate her because he thought she was incompetent. He was trying to intimidate her because he'd noticed something else, someone who paid attention to a patient's case with the precision of someone who had classified reasons to care. The next words came quietly, spoken to no one, the same way soldiers speak to themselves in the dark. He knows someone's watching. The reassignment notice was waiting in her locker by 1100, printed, official, signed by Dr. Pierce and countersigned by the unit director, though the director's signature looked like it had been added without the director present. Effective immediately. Performance Management Protocol 6.4.2. Due to repeated documentation concerns and failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with assigned patients, Nurse Cooper is hereby reassigned from ICU rotation to medical surgical rotation, pending successful completion of mandated retraining and supervisor observation. This reassignment is not disciplinary in nature but precautionary. Reassignment duration, minimum 30 days. 30 days. Colonel Webb had been in the ICU for 19 days. The attending surgeon estimated another 7 to 10 days before he'd be medically cleared for transport back to Walter Reed. If the timeline held, Ashley would miss his discharge. She'd lose access to his charts. She'd lose proximity to the fraud investigation that was currently invisible to everyone except Pierce, Ashley, and whatever surveillance algorithm the Pentagon had hidden inside Seattle General's network. But that wasn't the real calculation. The real calculation was that Dr. Pierce had just neutralized his primary threat. He turned her presence from an asset into a liability. He'd taken her off the board with a single administrative stroke, and he'd done it in a way that would look completely legitimate if anyone ever asked questions later. Just move you to MedSurg for a month, he'd say. Standard performance management. Nothing personal. Ashley changed into her scrubs for the MedSurg rotation at 1400, heading to the 3rd floor with a patient assignment list that included post-op hip replacements and a woman recovering from appendicitis removal. Nothing urgent. Nothing that required the kind of attention Colonel Webb required. Nothing that would keep her anywhere near the ICU after 1600 when her shift ended. The MedSurg floor smelled different, cleaner, quieter, the ambient anxiety lower because most of the patients on this floor were already improving. People whose crises had already passed. Ashley moved through the afternoon with the efficiency of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times, checking drain tubes and adjusting pain medication, answering call lights and updating charts. Her hands moved on muscle memory. Her voice remained gentle with patience. Her documentation was flawless. But her attention was elsewhere, tracking the time like a countdown clock. 1500, 1530. 1545, the afternoon shift was ending, and the night shift was beginning its ascent. Somewhere 3 floors below, Colonel Webb was sleeping, or trying to sleep, his body still mending from injury sustained in Bagram 6 weeks ago when an IED had penetrated his left anterior chest wall and collapsed his lung. The medical chart described it clinically: traumatic hemopneumothorax with retained shrapnel, successfully extracted, lung function restored to baseline. What the chart didn't describe was the weight of it, the way trauma settled into bone and stayed there, the way a soldier carried it even after the physical wounds closed. She understood that weight. She carried her own. At 16:15, Ashley was charting the final vitals for her MedSurg patients when her phone vibrated in her pocket, the hospital-issued device, the one that connected her to normal hospital communications. The message came from the billing department again, this time direct instead of hospital-wide. Captain, regarding flagged procedures, please provide brief written explanation for documentation on cases B-Web is 041, B-Web is 047, B-Web is 053, and B-Web 062. Reference numbers attached. Response required by 1800 tomorrow. The message had been sent to her personal device, not the hospital email. Someone in billing had her personal number. Someone had looked up her name against the flagged cases, had noticed the correlation between her charting and the irregularities, and had decided to ask her directly rather than escalate through channels. Which meant someone in billing was paying attention too. Ashley deleted the message, then deleted it again from the deleted folder, the way you delete something when you want no digital record that you ever received it. She clocked out at 16:30, her first shift on MedSurg complete, her reassignment now official and documented. The parking lot was dark by 1700, October rain beginning to fall in that particular Seattle way, not aggressive, just persistent, the kind of rain that didn't hammer but slowly soaked everything through. Ashley sat in her car for 5 minutes before starting the engine, reviewing the architecture one more time. 17 flagged procedures. 11 involving Colonel Webb. A billing pattern that suggested systematic fraud. A doctor who'd noticed surveillance and had responded by removing the surveilling party from his immediate vicinity. A personnel file that now carried a negative entry that would make it harder for Ashley to access restricted areas, harder to move through the hospital without questions, harder to maintain her cover. And somewhere in the billing department, someone who was asking for documentation that didn't match the billing codes, which meant someone had already pieced together the fraud structure, which meant the timeline was accelerating whether Ashley wanted it to or not. She started the car. The rain continued its persistent work against the windshield. And 3 floors up in the ICU, Colonel Marcus Webb slept through the evening, unaware that the nurse who'd been assigned to watch over his case recovery had just been removed from the board, exactly the way Dr. Pierce had intended. What happened next didn't just change the game. It changed everything. At 2200, the monitor started screaming. Colonel Marcus Webb's heart rate climbed past 120. His oxygen saturation dropped to 84 and kept falling. The ICU fell into that particular chaos that looks calm to anyone watching, nurses moving with urgent precision, the ventilator cycling faster, the alarm bouncing off every surface like it wanted out of the building. Ashley was 2 floors down in MedSurg, reassigned as of that afternoon, her name stripped from the colonel's chart by direct order. She felt it the way soldiers feel incoming artillery, a pressure change in the air, a vibration in the bones that doesn't need sound to carry meaning. She didn't check the time. She didn't need to. She stayed in MedSurg for 40 minutes anyway. That's what discipline looked like. That's what following orders looked like when you were trained to follow them to the letter. She bandaged a patient's post-op incision with the same careful attention Pierce demanded, the same precision that should have mattered, should have meant something. At 22:47, she texted Jake, working late. Don't wait up. Her son, her beautiful boy in his army uniform, sleeping in the next zip code over at Fort Carson, would assume it was routine. He had no idea his mother was sitting still while a man 3 floors above her was dying because the doctor in charge was deliberately slow to respond to vital sign changes. Because Pierce had marked her as a threat and Webb was the leverage. At 0300, the monitor flatlined. Not metaphorically. Not close. The alarm that came through the hospital that night sounded like something breaking inside machinery that wasn't supposed to break. Code blue. ICU room 347. All hands call. Every available body in motion. Ashley was already moving. She'd left MedSurg at 0255, walked past the break room where Pierce sat drinking coffee, deliberately not watching the monitor bank. He was still sitting there when she passed again, her badge clipped to her scrubs like it still meant access, like 4 hours ago didn't erase her clearance. The ICU nurses were running circles, 2 at the bedside, 1 pushing epinephrine, another bagging oxygen into the colonel's lungs while his chest stayed still, his heart refusing to beat on its own. His oxygen saturation was 34. His blood pressure was gone. The monitor showed nothing but the electrical noise of a body shutting down. Webb's eyes were open. Pupils blown. No reaction to stimuli. Tension pneumothorax, Ashley said. It wasn't a question. His left lung had collapsed, the pressure inside his chest cavity building with every breath the ventilator forced in, squeezing the heart, stopping the blood from moving. Classic presentation after penetrating chest trauma. Classic because it was a death sentence in the field, and Webb had survived Bagram, so he'd know the feeling. His body was remembering. "We need cardio down here," the charge nurse said, already reaching for the phone. "Where's Pierce?" Ashley was already in the supply room. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the place she'd been taught, the place she'd done this before with mortar fire shaking the bunker around her and a 19-year-old Marine bleeding out on her hands. The hiss of air escaping, high-pressure air screaming out of his chest cavity. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. His oxygen climbed, 58, 62, 68. His heart rate came back first, then his pressure, then the color returned to his lips. The blonde on his upper lip that she'd noticed 3 weeks ago when he was stable, when he was just a patient, before Pierce decided she was the real problem. But the bleeding didn't stop. That was the part Pierce's inadequate monitoring had missed. The gunshot wound from Bagram had been treated in a field hospital in Kandahar, stitched by a surgeon who did her best with what she had. But internal hemorrhage doesn't announce itself. It waits. It bleeds into the spaces between organs, dark and patient, until the moment it decides to matter. Webb's blood pressure started slipping again at 0.318. 60 drops per minute. The monitor showing shock, that particular flatline quality of a body running out of blood to pump. 20 minutes to cardiac arrest. The surgeon never arrived. Pierce emerged from the break room at 0323, unhurried, already composing the incident report in his mind. Ashley watched him move past the room without looking inside, watched him consult his phone like the answer was somewhere in his messages. She watched him take his time. She walked out of the ICU at 0315. Her locker was in the basement, in a locker room that smelled like bleach and old metal, the fluorescent light above hers blinking like it was trying to send Morse code. She'd wrapped the knife in surgical cloth 3 years ago, after her last tour, after the bunker collapse at Bagram when her hands had been inside a 17-year-old Marine's chest for 9 hours straight, controlling bleeding, keeping his heart perfused, keeping him alive until a helicopter could land. The knife was a Ka-bar, marine-grade steel, the kind that doesn't rust, the kind that remembers what it was made for. She unwrapped it slowly. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling would have been disrespect to the knife, to the skills, to the man upstairs whose name was Webb and whose daughter thought her father's nurse was just a quiet woman who stayed late. Back in room 347, she locked the door. She'd done this twice in combat. Never with an audience. Never in an ICU with fluorescent lights and a clock on the wall showing 0327. The incision went between his ribs, fourth intercostal space, lateral thoracotomy, the blade moving like it had muscle memory separate from her brain. The pericardium opened. His heart was there, grey and struggling, chambers not filling because blood was pouring into his chest cavity faster than his body could compensate. The bleeding vessel was the pulmonary vein, nicked during the initial trauma, held in some kind of precarious stasis for 9 days and finally giving up. She clamped it with her gloved fingers. Direct pressure. Then she stayed there, her hand inside his chest, her fingers maintaining perfusion, her other hand managing the bleeding, her voice steady as a flat line, "I've got you, Colonel. Just like you had Jake in Kandahar. Just like you brought my son home twice. I've got you." He couldn't hear her. His brain was too far gone for that. But her hands worked anyway. For hours. That's what the record would show, the timestamp from when she entered until she stepped back, her arms exhausted in a way that suggested something far more military than emergency medicine. She'd stayed the entire time, never leaving his side, never breaking contact, her fingers controlling the bleeding vessel, her presence the only thing keeping his heart moving, keeping his brain oxygenated, keeping the colonel tethered to a body that wanted to quit. She talked to him the entire time. Soft voice, steady rhythm, the kind of medical narrative that sounds like prayer. Blood pressure climbing, 80, 85, 90. Heart rate finding rhythm. Oxygen saturation settling at 94. The sounds of recovery replacing the sounds of death. At 0445, Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. His face did something complex, shock first, then a quick calculation that moved across his features like a shadow passing over water. His eyes went to Webb's monitor, then to Ashley's hands, still inside the Colonel's chest, then to the knife she'd set on the sterile field. In that moment, his expression shifted from shock to something else entirely: opportunity. He'd been looking for leverage. She'd just given him a weapon. He pulled her into the hallway before she could finish closing. 2 security guards materialized like they'd been waiting just out of sight. Pierce's tablet was already in his hands, his fingers moving, documenting, his voice taking on that particular clinical tone that meant bureaucracy, meant finality. Hospital Policy 7.3.2 regarding unauthorized invasive procedures by non-physician staff. His words sounded like they were coming from somewhere outside him, from some manual, some protocol written by people who'd never held a human heart in their hands. You performed a field thoracotomy without surgical oversight. Without authorization. Without. He was dead. Ashley's voice was quiet. Factual. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. No surgeon available. No other options. Your delay cost him 17 minutes. Pierce's jaw tightened. You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. Pending a full disciplinary review. He was already typing on his tablet, already composing the termination email, already moving on to the next thing like the Colonel's heartbeat was already historical. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal effects. Your badge access is revoked. Ashley pulled off her gloves without comment. The first one peeled away with a soft sound, like something leaving skin. The second followed. She collected her jacket from the break room, the one with the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside the lining, the one she touched for luck before every shift, the one that had just stopped being lucky. The patch pressed against her ribs as she fastened the buttons, familiar and burning, a secret becoming a liability. She drove home in silence, watching the sunrise over the mountains like it was happening to someone else, watching the world wake up to the morning of the day she'd saved a Colonel's life and lost everything in the process. By the time she pulled into her driveway in Colorado Springs, the sun was high enough to cast hard shadows, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes after catastrophe, that the mission she'd trained 3 years to complete had just ended before anyone even knew she was fighting. The faded patch in her jacket lining suddenly felt like the only thing keeping her together. And it wasn't enough. Dr. Pierce entered the ICU at 0347 with his tablet already glowing, his face transformed from shock to something darker, opportunity. The room smelled like copper and antiseptic, the ventilator still hissing its mechanical rhythm as Ashley's hands maintained manual pressure inside Colonel Webb's chest cavity, her fingers steady against his left atrium where the hemorrhage had finally begun to slow. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Her entire focus existed in that 5-inch window of exposed ribs and bleeding tissue, in keeping a decorated officer's heart perfused while his daughter slept in the waiting room and his commanding officers waited for a phone call that would either say hero or casket. Pierce's voice cut through the monitor's steady beeping like a scalpel through silk. Step away from the patient. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never had his authority questioned. Ashley kept her hands exactly where they were. The Colonel's oxygen saturation was climbing, 88, 91, 94, each number a small victory she'd earned with 8 years of trauma medicine and 4 hours of manual intervention that no textbook had authorized. Captain Cooper, I'm invoking Hospital Policy 7.3.2 regarding unauthorized invasive procedures by non-physician staff. Step away now. She stepped away. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce was already typing on his tablet, his fingers moving with the precision of someone documenting evidence for a prosecution. His words came in staccato bursts, each one another nail in the coffin he'd been building since the moment he'd noticed her paying too much attention to a Delta Force colonel's medical records. Unauthorized thoracic intervention. Non-physician personnel. Clear violation of surgical protocol. Patient endangerment despite positive outcome. He paused, and his jaw tightened in that particular way that suggested he was crafting the email to hospital administration right there in real time, the one that would describe her actions not as heroic but as reckless, unhinged, a threat to patient safety that needed to be removed from the facility immediately. "You're suspended effective immediately," Pierce announced, still not looking at her, his eyes locked on his tablet screen like a general surveying conquered territory. "Pending a full investigation into this incident. Security will escort you from the premises. Don't attempt to contact Colonel Webb or any other patient in this unit." He finally looked up, and his smile was the smile of a man who believed he'd just removed a threat that could have unraveled everything: the billing fraud, the coded procedures, the systematic exploitation of combat veterans' classified medical histories that had funded his country club membership and his downtown Seattle condo. Ashley's hand was already reaching for the sink, for the soap dispenser mounted on the ICU wall. She washed the colonel's blood from her fingers with methodical precision, between each knuckle, under each nail, the way you did after a field op when there was no shower and water was all you had. Her composure was exactly what it had been 4 hours ago when she'd first made the decision to become the only surgeon available in a facility where every attending had chosen to be somewhere else. No trembling. No voice crack. Just hands moving under warm water while Colonel Webb's monitor beeped its steady rhythm in the background, sinus rhythm, strong, the rhythm that meant she'd bought him for more hours of life at minimum. She dressed in silence and walked out of Seattle General at 0423, still wearing her scrubs because she couldn't think of anything else to do, her hand shaking now that nobody was watching, her cover fractured beyond any repair protocols her handlers at Joint Intelligence Operations Command could possibly manage. The parking lot was empty and dark, the kind of pre-dawn Pacific Northwest darkness that felt like drowning in reverse, like the sky was pressing down instead of holding you up. Rain had started sometime during the 4-hour procedure, the kind of rain that hammered the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody was meant to see. She sat in her car for 17 minutes before turning the engine on. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, hair matted with sweat, eyes hollow with the particular exhaustion that came from keeping someone alive through sheer force of will and medical knowledge and the kind of muscle memory that only years in combat zones could carve into your nervous system. The faded unit patch in her jacket lining felt like it was burning against her ribs again, like it was trying to escape her skin because even cloth understood she'd just violated the first rule of cover work: never, under any circumstances, use your real skill set. Jake was already dressed in his Army PT uniform when she came through the front door at 0630, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his eyes sharp in the way of someone who'd inherited his mother's ability to read a room for threats. He was 23 years old and a ranger and stationed at Fort Lewis just like his father had been, and he took one look at her bloody scrubs and the way her jaw was clenched and asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you home early, Mom?" The kitchen light was too bright, fluorescent harsh, casting shadows under her cheekbones that made her look 10 years older than she'd looked 6 hours ago. She sat down at the kitchen table without answering, which was itself an answer, and Jake set down his coffee mug and didn't speak again because he'd learned a long time ago that his mother's silences contained more information than most people's speeches. "I had a situation," Ashley finally said, and the words felt like pulling nails from her tongue. "With a patient. It's being reviewed. Are you okay?" No. She wasn't okay. She'd just blown 14 months of operational planning and 2 months of careful positioning to save a man's life using field medicine that belonged in Kandahar, not in the third largest hospital system in the Pacific Northwest. Her operational handlers were going to have words. Her security clearance was probably already in question. And she couldn't tell her son any of it because the moment she did, she'd be dragging him into a classified briefing that would change how he looked at his commanding officer forever. "I'm fine," she said instead, and it was the best lie she had, the lie of a woman who'd learned to compartmentalize survival into neat boxes that never touched each other. The Seattle General Security Clearance audit flagged her classification status exactly 72 hours later. "Routine renewal process," the email said. Nothing unusual. Just updating military personnel records as required by the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. The words felt like dominoes preparing to fall, first the flag, then the inquiry, then the revelation that Captain Ashley Cooper wasn't just a civilian nurse but an active-duty intelligence asset embedded in a facility flagged by the FBI for Medicare fraud perpetrated by a physician whose escalating attempts to destroy her had been occurring in real time. By the time Colonel Webb regained consciousness at 08:47 on the fourth day after the procedure, the chain reaction was already in motion. His eyes opened slowly, the way eyes do after 4 days of fentanyl and propofol, his pupils dilating toward the light like flowers after rain. And the first coherent words out of his mouth, whispered to the Marine liaison officer standing at his bedside, were the words that would change everything. Nightingale 6. The Marine's posture stiffened. He stepped back, and Ashley recognized the look, the moment when a soldier realizes he's been standing next to a legend and didn't know it. Nightingale 6 was a call sign from Bagram, a medical officer whose work keeping soldiers alive under fire had become classified operation mythology, the kind of story special operations units told each other in the dark about human beings exceeding their physiological limits. The liaison officer's radio crackled. "All units, be advised, priority notification to command. Patient has confirmed asset status." Within 20 minutes, the hospital room had transformed into something between a security briefing and a state funeral. 2 agents from the FBI's white-collar crime task force stood by the door. A Navy commander entered with a folder marked Top Secret Sensitive Compartmented Information. And a 2-star general in dress uniform walked through the ICU doors with the kind of authority that made subordinates breathe differently, their shoulders straightening just by his proximity. The general stepped to the foot of Colonel Webb's bed, and his presence made the air pressure change, like a system moving in from the coast. He was holding a citation card, the kind used for official commendations, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of recorded history. "Captain Cooper," he began, reading from the card with the kind of precision that meant every word had been officially approved by 6 different agencies. "For extraordinary valor during combat operations at Bagram Airfield, where you stabilized 3 critical casualties under direct fire, maintained manual cardiac massage for 1 operator for 73 minutes in active combat zone, and refused medical evacuation despite being wounded yourself. Distinguished Service Cross. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart." Dr. Pierce burst into the room mid-sentence, his face the color of overcooked beef, his voice the voice of a man watching his constructed world atomize in real time. "What is the meaning of this? This patient requires medical care, not some military propaganda ceremony. I'm calling security to remove Dr. Marcus Pierce." The FBI agent's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that contained absolute certainty. "You're placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." But Pierce wasn't listening. He was staring at the general, at the Marine, at Colonel Webb propped up in the hospital bed with a breathing tube still taped to his face and the kind of look in his eyes that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since the moment Ashley first walked into his ICU room and began paying too much attention to his care. The general turned back to Webb. "Your commanding officer also asked me to convey her personal thanks. She says you can return to duty as soon as recovery permits." He paused, and something that might have been compassion crossed his face. "And Captain Cooper is cleared for unrestricted operational duty, effective immediately. Her cover is blown, but her honor is intact." Webb's daughter, the one who'd been sitting in the waiting room for 4 days straight, the one who'd watched a nurse with military-grade composure save her father's life and then get suspended for doing it, had filmed the last part. Her phone captured Dr. Pierce's face as his medical career evaporated in real time, her camera caught the general reading the citation, and her caption when she posted it 18 hours later was the one that would reach for million views before Dr. Pierce's former mentor ever saw it. "Doctor refuses to let Army nurse be honored after she saved my dad's life with her bare hands." By morning, the comment section had filled with veterans. Combat medics talking about billing irregularities they'd noticed. Engineers mentioning procedures they'd undergone that seemed unnecessarily extensive. Officers describing consultations that lasted 5 minutes but generated invoices for surgical intervention. Each comment another thread for investigators to pull, another confirmation of the systematic Medicare fraud that had been happening in plain sight while Dr. Pierce had been too preoccupied with destroying Ashley Cooper to hide his tracks. Dr. Raymond Foster, the renowned trauma surgeon from Johns Hopkins who'd written Pierce's residency recommendation 20 years ago, saw the video at 0614 on a Monday morning. He was 67 years old with silver hair and a reputation that spanned decades, and he picked up his phone and called his former protege with the kind of controlled rage that only comes from recognizing betrayal in someone you'd mentored. "I saw the video, Marcus. I saw what you've become. I taught you to honor the oath, and you used your gifts to steal from wounded soldiers." The call lasted 43 seconds. By Tuesday, Dr. Foster had published a formal disavowal in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in Trauma Surgery Quarterly, and in Surgeons Forum, triggering an automatic board review that would examine every case Pierce had touched in the past 18 months. By Wednesday, his medical license was suspended pending formal revocation. By Thursday, his wife, who'd stuck with him through residency and 2 malpractice suits and a gambling problem he'd never quite disclosed, served him with divorce papers citing the $2.3 million in financial liability his fraud investigation created. Within a week, the investigation had spiraled so completely that it needed its own task force. 18 months of systematic Medicare fraud. 63 victims. Billing for procedures never performed. Coding minor lacerations as complex surgical interventions. Exploiting combat veterans' classified medical histories to obscure the discrepancies in a way that would make their own medical records inadmissible as evidence in any proceeding that wasn't also classified. The hospital settled with the Justice Department for $8.7 million. Pierce's attorney negotiated a plea deal, 5 years probation, $500,000 in restitution, permanent loss of medical license, 2,000 hours of community service, and a permanent notation on the medical board's public database. His downtown Seattle condo went into foreclosure. His country club membership was terminated. His wife took the house in Medina and full custody of their teenage daughter. And the medical community he'd spent 20 years cultivating discovered they'd never actually known him at all. 6 months later, Jake called his mother from Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, his voice carrying the particular excitement of someone who'd just witnessed cosmic coincidence. "Mom, you're not going to believe this. I just saw Dr. Pierce driving a medical supply van past the base gates. Blue uniform. Name tag. He looked absolutely defeated. He was completing his 2,000 hours of community service by delivering oxygen tanks and bedpans to the very veterans he'd defrauded, a punishment administered not by any judge but by the simple mathematics of consequence. Sometimes the universe has a sense of poetry." That same afternoon, Ashley stood in her dress uniform at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the ceremony room filled with soldiers and commanders and the quiet authority of people who'd spent their lives defending something larger than themselves. Colonel Webb, recovered and returned to active duty, stood at full attention before her. The citation was being read by the same 2-star general who'd arrived at Seattle General 6 months prior, and his voice carried through the room with the weight of official recognition. Captain Ashley Cooper, Distinguished Service Cross, for extraordinary heroism in combat operations and continued service beyond the call of duty, risking your operational security and your career to ensure a wounded soldier received the medical care required to preserve his life. Webb pinned a medal to her chest, and his voice when he spoke was steady as a surgical laser. "You stayed with me for 4 hours straight the night I was dying. Never left my side. That's what warriors do. They stay when everyone else leaves." Jake stood in the front row in his own uniform, finally understanding why his mother moved the way she did, why she touched that patch before every shift, why she always came home with stories about the colonel who reminded her of someone important. The room erupted in applause, and Ashley allowed herself to smile, truly smile, for the first time in 6 months. Her hand rested over the pocket where that faded unit patch now sat, no longer hidden but displayed as evidence of what she'd always been, what she'd always carried, what no institution could ever take away. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If Ashley's story resonates with you, subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet heroism and extraordinary courage. Like this video and comment below. Tell us about the medical professionals who've stayed when others left, the unrecognized heroes working in hospitals and battlefields across this country. Their stories deserve to be heard.